Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you on this last day of an incredible month of AHE sessions of the 22nd Annual Conference of the Association for Heterodox Economics. And we are very pleased to bring to you this concluding plenary panel of the conference, which is co-organized by the Economic Development Working Group in the History of Economic Thought Working Group of the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking with AHE this year. Now, the title of the panel today is Heterodox Economics, Perspectives from the Global South. And as you can see from your screen, there is a stellar panel that we have for this concluding plenary. Before I go to introduce the panelists, I would just like to take a couple of minutes in order to just place this discussion that we have today in context to kind of relate all the talks of our plenary speakers in this broad context of the topic today. Now, where is it and why is it that this idea of perspectives from Global South becomes a conversation that we need to have, and particularly for a time like this? Now, in this context, I would briefly like to talk about this idea of universalizations of ideas and approaches in economics. When one is engaging with social science, where it is often difficult, if not impossible, to universalize all phenomenon, in that attempt to universalize, one often ends up privileging one idea or one stance or one viewpoint, and at even times one context over the other. Now, this privileged idea or this privileged approach of understanding is then often awarded the status of the universal. In this process, however, there's an active occlusion of the ideas, contexts, viewpoints that cannot afford this privilege. If these ideas or realities are not occluded, the discourse actively renders them as, what Spivak would refer to as others or mistakes or not normal. Now, one of the basic examples of how this is done is in the discourse of economic development, where the reality of an underdeveloped nation is seen as a mistake. And that sort of understanding of a mistake is actively created because that doesn't fill the idea of what is privileged. This has for the longest time been one of the critiques, the central critiques of the mainstream paradigm by the heterodox approaches. However, it is this universalization, even though in a little different context, that even heterodoxy happens to do. And that is particularly in this idea of sometimes using or sometimes employing determinist understandings and determinist frameworks that are often Western-centric, Eurocentric, and devoid of the Global South perspectives in their understandings. Of course, within heterodoxy itself, given that one of the tools that we are taught is that of critique, this has not gone uncontested. There have been works by several eminent scholars and thinkers who have questioned this idea of universalization and Eurocentrism, or if I may even say a determinist thinking. And these range from a wide, from post-developmentalists to dependency theorists, from its later critique then by the post-colonial theorists, postmodern or the non-determinist Marxism, who've critiqued a lot of the heterodox approaches as well for their Eurocentrism. These works, the works that I just referred to, have tried to displace West as the locus of the economic thinking, with everything else swimming in the sea of others. Now, the project of this Global South-centric understanding is not to replace one for the others. It's not about simply shifting contexts or positionalities. The project here is to build frameworks and tools that allow for a non-determinist understanding and that allow to go or move beyond these universalizations. And as economists, I think this responsibility is rather profound because it is not limited to discussions and discourses within academia, rather extends much beyond those academic walls to shaping the real world realities. Now, it is in this context that we are going to place today's discussion. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce you to today's stellar panel that we have. Our first plenary panelist is the eminent scholar and thinker, Professor Prabhat Patnaik from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His works ranging from issues of development, imperialism, and his contributions have been fundamental in informing the discourse on economic development, more particularly so in terms of India's economic development. Today, he will be presenting on globalization, inequality, and economic crisis. Thanks a lot, Professor Patnaik, for joining us. It's our absolute pleasure to have you here. Our second panelist today is Professor Lucia Pradella from King's College London. Her works on globalization, imperialism, labor, and Eurocentrism have been salient contributions to the current economic scholarship on these issues. And today she will be presenting on a very interesting topic, bordering the surplus population across the Mediterranean, imperialism and unfree labor in Libya and Italian countryside. Thanks a lot for joining us, Professor Pradella. Our third and final panelist is Professor Yahya Madra from Drew University. His contributions, particularly in the critique of the late neoclassical theory, the evolution of development economics and political economics, are critical in understanding the progress and limits of the mainstream discourse. Thanks a lot for joining us, and he will be presenting today on Whither development after neoliberalism, corporate nationalism versus democratic economy. Thanks a lot, Professor Madra, for joining us as well. The format that we'll be following today is going to be each presenter will be speaking for 20 minutes. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to enter your question and use the chat box in order to alert us for any technical difficulties that you might be facing. So with that, may I please request Professor Patnaik to present his thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Surbhi. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I shall be talking about globalization, inequality, and the economic crisis. Every day we hear about the enormous contractions which are taking place in very many economies because of the COVID-19 and the lockdown associated with it. Now this poses two kinds of questions. The first, of course, is that given the scale of this contraction, getting back to some sort of a recovery itself is going to be a very prolonged affair. Even if the consumption goods sector in most advanced countries recovers to somewhere the level where it was earlier, investment goods sectors would take a very long time to recover because, as you know, they depend upon the degree to which investment orders are placed, and that in turn depends upon the degree to which people expect growth to take place. So mere recovery in the consumption goods sector is not enough to stimulate a recovery in the investment goods sector, which is exactly what had happened in the 1930s at the time of the Great Depression. By the late 1930s, consumption goods were more or less producing at 90% or 80% of the capacity, but investment goods sector was producing at 10% of its capacity in the United States. But there is a second issue which is also involved here, second question, namely that even before COVID-19, there was a tendency for a crisis to be emerging in world capitalism. Now, this is something which was manifest in very many different ways. In a sense, the advanced countries never really recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, I'm talking about the real impact of the financial crisis. It's true that in the United States, there was talk that there was 3.5% unemployment, which was the lowest in the last half century or whatever. President Trump used to talk about it. But as a matter of fact, there was also a significant reduction in the participation rate. So if you adjust for the workforce participation rate, if you assume the same workforce participation rate prevailed in the US before, say in 2019, as had prevailed in 2008, then you'd find that unemployment rate in the US itself was as much as 8%. Now, in addition, countries like India and China, which were fast-growing economies, which actually had, to all appearances, weathered the 2008 storm, were beginning to slow down. I know that in India, for instance, 2018 was a year in which the unemployment rate was the highest that it has ever been in the last half century or so. then you find that the primary commodity prices had in fact crashed from 2011 onwards. Between April 2011 and December 2019, you find a 38% drop in the IMF prepared all commodities price index. So the world economy itself was actually slowing down considerably. By the way, this period of collapse in primary commodity prices is the period in which a lot of third world debt expanded, ballooned, particularly, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, which is now emerging as a very big crisis. So the point is that the world economy was actually beginning to slow down. This actually raises the question that when we recover from the impact of the COVID-19, we cannot assume that once more the world economy would back to its normal trajectory of development. On the contrary, it would be in a prolonged period of crisis, not only because, as I said, the investment goods sector takes a long time to come out of a crisis, but above all because the COVID crisis itself is ensconced within a much longer crisis. Now, I want to talk about this longer crisis, much more the deeper crisis within which we suddenly find ourselves thrown in by this COVID-19 emergency. Now, I think one of the features of the contemporary globalization is that there has been capital movement of a kind that you never saw any time in the past, including the location of production facilities. Not only mobility of finance, but mobility of productive capital. In the entire colonial period, for instance, you know, the British economy, Britain was the largest capital exporter, but no more than 10% of the entire British capital exports really came to the to the tropical colonies of Britain. Much of it went to the United States or the temperate regions of European settlement. Very little came to the third world countries or the tropical colonies. Now, this therefore was a pattern which one had got used to expecting over time, but the current globalization has broken with that. Has really meant substantial movement, not only of productive capital, but of course of finance. Now, this movement of productive capital has meant that in the advanced countries, the workers' fate, fortune, is now no longer detached from the fate and fortune of the third world workers, but on the contrary, to the extent that the third world workers' wages continue to be low, capital would shift from the advanced countries to the third world, and therefore that would be a blow against the trade union movement in the advanced countries, and therefore their wages too are going to be affected by this mobility of capital. And within the third world, since the workers' wages are more or less kept close to a subsistence level because of the huge labor reserves within which these workers are placed, you find that now the advanced country workers' fortunes are also linked to the huge third world labor reserves. For these reasons, you find that really the vector of third world and advanced country wages, the vector of wages across the world really does not go up. I'm not saying the wages get equalized, that they don't, but on the other hand, you find that the vector of wages does not go up. In fact, Stiglitz made a calculation according to which between 1968 and 2011, if you look at the real wages of male American workers, then you find that in 2011, they were marginally lower than in 1968. Not that they were steadily declining, but in fact they had gone up, but on the other hand, there is now, they have reached a point where, they've come down, they've reached a point where they are marginally lower than in 1968. So the vector of real wages is not increasing across the world. But on the other hand, the vector of labor productivities is obviously increasing everywhere. It is increasing. Therefore, the proportion of surplus in world output has increased greatly. Now, this is the cause for two very significant phenomena that we notice. One is that you find that inequalities have gone up greatly. People like Piketty have documented it, but the explanation they provide in terms of neoclassical growth theory, which assumes full employment all the time, is really a completely false and erroneous explanation. To my mind, the explanation lies in the fact that the proportion of surplus in world output, and in fact in every country's output, has gone up greatly. And of course, the surplus earners, the surplus is not only appropriated by the capitalists, it is distributed across the elite. But the surplus earners on the whole have a higher level of per capita income than the working people, by which I include workers, peasants, artisans, fishermen, and so on. As a result, an increase in the share of surplus is also associated with growing income inequality in terms of interpersonal inequality. And as a result, the inequality we observe and has been documented by people like Piketty is really explicable by this phenomenon of globalization and the fact that the huge third world labor reserves are now beginning to have a baneful effect on wages everywhere across the world. The second consequence of this change which has taken place, this outsourcing of manufacturing activities to countries like China, the outsourcing of services to countries like India from the advanced countries. Now, the second implication is that this increase in the share of surplus has an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction. This is very well known, very common, because the marginal propensity to consume out of a unit of surplus income is lower than the marginal propensity to consume out of a unit of wage income or income of peasants and so on. As a result, every such income distributional shift has the effect of producing an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction. Now, if consumption tends to slow down, consumption growth tends to slow down, investment growth would, with a time lag, also begin to slow down. And there's no reason why investment should increase when consumption is slowing down. On the contrary, when consumption slows down, investment over a period of time would also begin to slow down. And therefore, this ex-ante tendency to overproduction is something which is going to then give rise to an overall tendency towards an economic crisis. Now, this has been visible for some time, but on the other hand, this has been kept in check because of asset price bubbles, particularly in the United States. In the 1990s, you had the dot-com bubble. In the 2000s, you had the housing bubble. The asset price bubbles have the effect also of stimulating the real economy, at least had the effect of stimulating the real economy, because of which this ex-ante tendency towards overproduction was actually kept in check. Now, however, after the collapse of the housing bubble, this is no longer the case. After all, firstly, you cannot order a bubble. One of the reasons why the monetary policy has been so much of a failure, why interest rates, despite being driven down to zero, and by the way, driving the interest rates to zero is not so much meant to stimulate investment as we are taught in textbooks and so on, but is much more to actually stimulate asset price bubbles. But of course, this increase in this decrease in the interest rate, almost down to zero in the United States, is not really creating the kind of impact that governments expected it to have. And as a result, you have now this coming into open of this ex-ante tendency towards overproduction that I associated with globalization. Now, it is in this context that even after the COVID-19 crisis is over, the world economy would be stuck in a fairly prolonged, protracted structural crisis of overproduction. Now, this, therefore, requires a kind of thinking of how to get out of the crisis, which is not at all, at the moment, very clearly visible. The two obviously, fiscal policy would be the way that Keynes had said you could use to get out of crisis situations. But fiscal policy implies fiscal policy would be effective, government spending would be effective only if it is financed in one of two ways. If it is financed through a fiscal deficit, it will be effective. If it is financed not by a fiscal deficit, but by taxing the capitalists or by taxing the surplus earners, then it will be effective. Why? Because taxing the workers or taxing wage incomes or taxing the incomes of the working people is something which really has very little net expansionary effect on aggregate demand, because whatever the government spends is roughly exactly equal to whatever these people, the working people, reduce their spending by. Therefore, the only two ways in which fiscal policy could work is either through a larger fiscal deficit or alternatively through a larger government spending financed by taxes on surplus incomes. But both these are anathema as far as finance capital is concerned. We live in a world in which we have nation states, the governments I'm talking about, those who pursue fiscal expansionary measures are all national governments, but finance is globalized. In fact, that's one of the central features of contemporary globalization. And if finance is globalized and the nation state, the government belongs to a nation state, then willy-nilly, as long as the government remains or the economy remains within this vortex of globalized finance, willy-nilly they have to listen to the dictates of finance, because otherwise there would be a financial outflow giving rise to a financial crisis. That is why all countries more or less pursue the so-called neoliberal policies. Within countries, all political formations, except those who are explicitly committed to actually getting out of this vortex of globalized finance, all of them pursue the same kinds of policies. And therefore, the two ways in which, so globalized finance does not want an active fiscal intervention by the state, and therefore there's no way in which we can get out of the crisis except two possibilities. One, if you actually have a coordinated fiscal stimulus across large numbers of important nation states, governments of important nation states, G20, for instance, if they all got together and had a coordinated fiscal stimulus, in that case, finance is unlikely. I mean, that is one way of making finance obey the dictates of the requirements. But that is something which nobody is even talking about. The other, I know that recently European Union has made some tentative steps towards it, but that's still too minor and tentative. By the way, this was a proposal made in the 1930s. Nobody even listened to it. So a coordinated fiscal stimulus across advanced countries is something which is one way, possibly, that finance could be brought to be disciplined. But on the other hand, that's not being talked about. The other is, of course, to opt out of this vortex of globalized finance by particular nation states who can then get out of this crisis through fiscal means, through welfare expenditures, through income redistribution pursued domestically. But that, of course, has the following problem, namely that the domestic rich, the domestic corporate financial oligarchy is very much a part of this globalized finance. So any such move is going to be very seriously opposed and objected to by your domestic financial corporate oligarchy, your domestic big bourgeoisie, who actually have a stranglehold over the state in this period of globalization. The second thing it would involve is, of course, very substantial opposition from imperialism, from the advanced countries led by the United States, very serious opposition to any attempt to de-link by any particular third world government from this kind of globalization of finance. Now, even though these oppositions would be there, it seems to me that there's no way that governments can really get out of this ex-ante overproduction crisis without adopting this measure of delinking, which in the absence of a global coordinated fiscal stimulus is the only way that they can act. And at the same time, to do that, they would require substantially the support of the domestic workers, peasants, petty producers, fishermen, craftsmen, and so on. So you would require a kind of third world state that actually has social support, class support of a different kind from the kind of neoliberal states we have been having before a delinking can be effected. But it seems to me that without such a delinking being effected, which can then clear the grounds for redistributive policies, for welfare expenditures by the state, you would find that that there is no way in which the crisis can be thwarted, particularly in many of these third world countries. Smaller third world countries may have to get together to carry through this process of delinking. Certainly big third world countries like my own or like Brazil and so on, India, Brazil and so on, are countries which can really move forward by getting rid of the crisis and at the same time bringing about a far greater egalitarian distribution domestically. For instance, enlarging government expenditure financed by wealth taxation, and this expenditure enlargement can actually take the form of raising the social wage, take the form of providing free healthcare, take the form of providing free education to the children of workers and peasants and so on. And this seems to be the only way of actually achieving a number of things at the same time. Firstly, it will be a democratic strategy. Secondly, it will be an egalitarian strategy. And third, it will be a strategy that would actually avert the kind of crisis which is threatening us. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Patnaik, for that extremely stimulating presentation and talk. Thanks a lot. I remember the last time I had the fortune of, organizing an event with you. It was Samir Amin's death anniversary, and at South Asian University, we organized the event. And I remember having this conversation about delinking there, and again, so it's pretty much come a full circle and very interesting. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions from the audience as well. So thanks a lot for that presentation. I would now request Professor Lucia Pradella to please make her presentation, and she will be presenting at on bordering the surplus population across the Mediterranean, imperialism and unfree labor in Libya and the Italian countryside.
Thank you very much, Surbhi, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this excellent panel and to be speaking after Professor Patnaik. So I'll try to share my screen and show my slides. Okay. Does it work?
Yeah. Do you want to present? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I think this is quite linked to what Professor Patnaik was talking about, and I want to start this talk by showing you two pictures. On the one side, you can see a very kind of famous picture of an African worker sold at a slave auction in Libya. This was from 2017. While on the right-hand side, there is another African worker, probably agricultural worker, this time in Italy, in Calabria. And these two workers really could be the same person, and in many cases they are, because many of the workers picking oranges, tomatoes, and olives that end up in Italian and Northern European supermarkets came through the desert, Libya, and the Mediterranean Sea. But in the literature, these sides of a common story are very often treated as separate. And several studies have highlighted the centrality of immigrant workers to Southern European agriculture in general and Italian agriculture in particular, and have argued that immigrant workers represent reserve army of underemployed and unemployed workers that allow farmers to meet the low production cost and just-in-time demands of big retail and agribusiness corporations. And if we look at Italy, the example of Italy is pretty stunning because in 1991, immigrant workers represented 0.3% of the total agricultural workforce, while today they're about half of the agricultural workforce. And these workers increasingly face conditions of severe exploitation, including unfree labor. In Italy, between 400,000 and 430,000 agricultural workers are employed irregularly, and about 100,000 of them risk being employed through a gang master or in conditions of severe exploitation. And the recent reports showed that this kind of gang master system is expanding also in the north of Italy. This is, I don't have very much time to explain this map, but it shows in green the areas of decent work in agriculture in Italy. And you see that they are really just maybe 5 or 7 throughout the country. So there is a condition of severe exploitation that affects workers throughout the country. And the literature on unfree labor has highlighted that the state plays an important role in enabling these conditions by, for example, enacting policies limiting labor mobility, deregulating the labor market, and empowering employers. But this literature, with a few notable exceptions, tends to conceptualize both the reserve army of labor and the role of the state in state-centric terms, leaving imperialism out of the picture. And this helps explain, from my point of view, why, despite all the emphasis on a so-called migration crisis in Europe, there is still little research on the impact of the NATO 2011 war against Libya and the militarization of EU borders in Mediterranean. So the impact of these processes on the development of unfree labor in Italian agriculture. And so in the article that Rossana Cillo and I just published on GeoForum, we sought to fill this gap. And we did so in the light of what we believe is Marx's own understanding of the global reserve army of labor. Because in our view, Marx anticipated contemporary studies like Patnaik's, for example, and Bellamy Foster's and others, on the role of imperialism in swelling the ranks of the reserve army of labor, which is a process that for Tom Brass and others is really important in order to understand the spread of unfree labor relations also in imperialist countries. So in the light of this framework, new colonial processes of resource extraction don't only allow for the appropriation of cheap raw materials, energy, and so on, but also lead to an expansion of the reserve army of labor of metropolitan capital. And this reserve army allows capital to increase the exploitation of the employed workers in a vicious circle of unemployment, underemployment on the one side, and super exploitation that operates globally, but in an uneven way. And from this perspective, borders represent a mechanism of differential containment and exploitation of the surplus population mobilized by the global uneven dynamic of capital accumulation. And the crucial point that is often neglected in the debate about borders is that migration generates new possibilities for the workers' movements. And so what Harsha Valya has defined as border imperialism seeks to prevent the coming together of increasingly international working classes, preventing them from becoming aware of and displaying the structural power that they have because of their role in production. And what we argue in this article is that already in Marx, in particular his analysis of Ireland, we can see an awareness that conditions in what we call today the global south or the ex-colonies are not external, but rebound on the conditions of workers in metropolitan countries, which is also due to processes of production restructuring, as Professor Patnaik discussed. And so from this point of view, and of course also labor mobility is another important factor, and that's why, as Malcolm X once said, you can't understand what's going on in Mississippi without understanding what's going on in the Congo. And the same, we believe, is true today, and we can't understand what's going on in Libya, in Italy, or in Europe if we don't understand what's going on in Libya and in the rest of the global south. Because, as Malcolm X said, well, the same interests are at stake and the same sides are drawn up. So there isn't a substantial difference. So in order to develop our analysis, we drew on there is really plenty of official reports, investigative articles, and online resources on Libya, including immigrants' own messages available online, because most of the immigrants in Libya, especially those detained in detention centers, use WhatsApp and social media to communicate with their families and the rest of the world. And there are some radio programs like Exodus, for example, that display, actually make available the messages from people in detention centers. And we also interviewed about 50 immigrants, trade unionists, investigative journalists, anti-racist activists, and labor inspectors over a sustained period of time. And this research confirmed the connection between the system of neocolonial extraction that imposed itself in Libya after the 2011 NATO intervention and the expansion of the reserve army of labor of Italian and EU capital. After 2011, the scramble for access to Libya's energy by Western states and corporations has empowered local militias increasingly integrated into state institutions, leading to increasing political fragmentation and civil war since 2014. And in this context, the Italian presence in Libya has become more predatory. In particular, in 2014, the multinational oil and gas corporation, Eni, the main Italian multinational corporation, interrupted the payment of reparations for the crimes of Italian colonialism that had been agreed with Gaddafi in 2008. And in order to ensure the extraction of Libyan energy, Eni struck deals with local tribes and militias that started to act as its security companies. Now, the point is that the same militias are also weapons and human trafficking, and also act as Coast Guard in the area of Sabrata with plenty of funding from Italy and the European Union. For the Libyan Audit Bureau, the smuggling of refined petroleum products cost the Libyan state around $20 billion between 2014 and 2017. So this is a huge neocolonial drain of Libyan resources that has caused widespread impoverishment and insecurity, and has pushed an increasing number of people, including Libyans themselves more recently, to leave the country for Europe. And in this context, the EU and Italian military presence in the Mediterranean has turned a blind eye on fuel smuggling and has mainly focused on protecting energy platforms like the Operazione Mare Nostro, that mainly protects any energy platforms in the Mediterranean, and on combating low-level smugglers, increasing the risks and the mortality for immigrants. So it's therefore not surprised, given this kind of strong support for human smugglers, that the results of all the memorandums of understanding between the EU and Libya, despite all the EU and Italian funding, despite all the very known human rights abuses happening in Libya, the process of so-called externalization of EU borders in Libya between 2011 and 2017 hasn't stopped migration. On the contrary, migration was increasing and peaked in May and June 2017, when arrivals increased to 23,000 each month. And then suddenly in July and August 2017, arrivals plummeted to 11,000 and 4,000 respectively. How did this happen? This was the result of deals that Italy's Interior Minister Marco Minniti and Italian secret services struck with tribes, militias, and smuggling networks in the west and the south of Libya. And these networks decided to operate as law enforcement entities of the Government of National Accord and block almost all departures from the west coast of Libya. Another thing that happened in the summer of 2017 is that part of Operation Mare Sicuro, which is the biggest naval operation, no one is talking about it, that is actually aimed at defending Eni's energy platform, was then deployed to support Libyan forces and extended into Libyan waters. So the Italian government started to collaborate directly with armed groups in Libya, superseding formal state authorities, and to exercise control of over the Libyan Coast Guard in a clear neo-colonial fashion. Yeah, so we shouldn't even talk about the Libyan Coast Guard, because this is actually an Italian Coast Guard controlled and funded by Italy and the European Union. So what are the consequences of all these deals and processes in Libya? Well, the main thing is that after 2017, Libyan militias shifted their focus from human smuggling to the business of detention and forced labor. And the number of people intercepted and returned to Libya and caged in overcrowded prisons increased. Immigrants claim that after so-called rescuing them, militias beat, imprison, and subject them, especially women, to sexual violence. And this is one testimony that is available online, an immigrant saying that the same people who manage the prison ask for money to embark immigrants in a better boat for Europe.
I think there's an issue with Lucia's connection. Sorry, Lucia, we just missed out the last 30 seconds. Could you just go over that?
All right. So another. So in addition to receiving millions of euros from the EU and extorting money from detainees, militias sell their detainees or rent them out, forcing them to work without pay in order to secure their release. And after July 2017, this system of forced labor has spread to all sectors of the Libyan economy and affects the majority of immigrants in the country, especially sub-Saharan Africans. And although the point is that although not all immigrants actually wanted to go to Europe in the first place, once they are in this kind of situation, they cannot find secure work in Libya, and they cannot even find safe transit back to their country of origin or to Europe. So they are trapped in a system that traps them in Libya, but at the same time pushes them towards Europe. And in a collective video messages, detainees in the Usama prison in Zawiya denounce this situation and say, they refuse to deport us. We told them that we want to go back to Africa, which is Black Africa, but they refuse to deport us. They don't want us to go back to go to Europe, and also they don't want us to go back to our countries. they're keeping us here for business. Yeah. And from interviews to about 7,000 immigrants that the International Organization for Migration made on the central Mediterranean route between 2016 and 2018, basically half of these 7,000 people, especially West Africans, had been forced to work along their journey. So this is a very widespread phenomenon. So what happens to these workers once and if they arrive in Europe? Well, I think that one of the main feelings is, of course, a feeling of liberation, right? So the idea that there are rights, formal rights in Italy, and well, these immigrants said, well, who leaves Libya and arrives in Italy, even if they don't have anything here, find a freedom, the freedom to walk with your head up, to say, to say what you think, and you can start to have another dream, the dream of being free. So the idea that a new life can start in Europe. And before the global economic crisis, agriculture was really a transit sector for many immigrants who were looking for jobs in other sectors or in northern Italy or in Northern Europe. But what happened after the global economic crisis, amid soaring unemployment, is that agriculture becomes basically a long-term insertion sector for many immigrants, and there is a process of re-ruralization of migration with immigrants from Northern Europe, from Northern Italy, who lost their job and documents and go back to agriculture. This coincides—
2 minutes, Lucia.
All right. This coincides with the increase in arrivals since 2011, and that actually boosted the number of immigrants seeking employment in agriculture. But at the same time, the Italian government reduces work quotas, so an increasing number of people seeks regularization by applying for asylum. And asylum seekers really become a valuable commodity for employers because they are provided with lodging and meals, and so employers use this to lower their wages and put them in competition with other workers. And this has generated a conflict with workers who had improved their conditions previously through strikes and mobilizations. So when we try to understand what kind of consequences Libya has on the people who arrive in Italy, what we found is that it exercises a disciplining role on the workers, because of course, even conditions of extreme exploitation look like an improvement. And we were particularly impressed by a worker from Mali who told us about not being paid and so on, but then said, well, and I said, well, that's not really a good thing. And they said, well, the wage is good, but I don't need it. If they don't pay me, that's not a problem, because I'm in Italy, I'm not beaten. Before I was in prison all the time, in Nigeria, in Libya, but here I am not in prison, I eat, I sleep well, God willing, right? So there is this kind of feeling that it's quite common. But another feeling that is quite common among the immigrants that we interviewed is that they feel that their formal freedom is very important as a way of improving their situation. And this kind of feelings has really animated the most important immigrant worker strikes and the struggles, including uprisings in agriculture since 2006. And these uprisings led to the first independent organization of immigrant agricultural workers in Italy, and also the first national immigrant worker strike in 2012. And one important example of these strikes is in Nardò in 2011, at the height of the North African emergency, when about 400 immigrants from the Maghreb and Sub-Saharan Africa started a 13-day strike against low wages and the gangmaster system. And there is an interview from like a speech by a Tunisian immigrant who had just come from Tunisia after the fall of Ben Ali, and said, well, in Tunisia, we autonomously drove away any dictatorship. And in a similar way, we can do similar things here because this is our right. And people coming from Libya said, well, this is no longer the age of slavery, and wanted to reclaim their former rights to bargain directly with the companies and be treated like all other workers. And it's important that because it took place at the height of the harvest season and because of the kind of reorganization of production along just-in-time production, this strike had a huge potential for disruption, and was a factor that accelerated the implementation of the law against the gangmaster system, and also then kind of led to increasing mobilizations in the countryside between 2015 and 2017, when there was a convergence between struggles in logistics and in agriculture. And okay, I know I have to conclude, but I think one important point about these struggles is that they shifted attention away from the gangmaster system to the multinational corporations, and also linked demands for better salaries and regularizations to a critique of the role of borders in the exploitation of workers, both in Africa and in Italy. Just 3 points really to conclude. The 2011 uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa resonated in the struggles of immigrant workers in southern Italy, pointing to the global scope of their experience of exploitation and struggle for emancipation. In this context, EU and Italian border imperialism in the Mediterranean has played a crucial role in supporting a system of neocolonial extraction and superexploitation. And this system, crucially, is aimed at disempowering and preventing the coming together of workers from across the Mediterranean. So if conditions of workers in the global south rebound on metropolitan countries as well, the ability of the labor movement and the anti-racist movements right now in Europe to overcome state-centric perspectives and oppose imperialism, I think, will be key to realizing the potential strengths of these movements. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Pradella, for that very interesting presentation. And while coming from two very different contexts, there are certain similarities that once put in that broader structure of imperialism and labor across the economies in Global South and elsewhere that can be brought out from the first presentation by Professor Patnaik and you. So thanks a lot for that very fascinating and interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll get the conversation going, and I request everyone to keep putting in the questions in the Q&A box. May I finally please request Professor Madra to make his presentation, and he will be presenting on Whither development after neoliberalism, corporate nationalism versus democratic economy. Very excited. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. My voice is coming through. Thank you I'm very sort of honored to be in this context, both being invited by Young Scholars Initiative and also be in the context of, as you said, such a stellar panel. I'm humbled by it. And what I'm trying to do today is I'll share the PowerPoint. Let me see if I can get this. It's a kind of a combination of actually three papers, but I dropped one paper, the corporate nationalism, as I was doing the time last night. And I will not talk about corporate nationalism, but I will try to talk about the trajectory of development economics and maybe an alternative way of approaching it as opposed to its current status. Let me start with a brief historical framework, theoretical framework to get a history of development economics. And this is all familiar stuff for many of you. But this is based on our paper with Bengi Akbulut and Fikret Adaman, where we tried to think of the trajectory of development economics as in a sort of tripartite framework to look at the developments in the discipline of economics, of course, contextualize it in the social formation, and using Arturo Escobar's framework, looking at the interface between the discipline, the theories, and the social formation, the institutional discursive matrix, which includes all sorts of international organizations and governments, policy frameworks, and so on and so forth. So in a kind of simplified manner, we historically sort of trace the narrative of the golden age of capitalism, so to speak, where the theoretical field in the discipline was the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis and the hydraulic model, if you like, which provided significant room for government intervention. And in the social formation, we're thinking about, of course, a kind of Fordist regime of accumulation or a Keynesian developmentalism, and in global south, if you like, and then also in the global north, a welfare state, advanced capitalist formations. And the sort of the key word here in terms of the interface is structural transformation. That is transformation from rural to urban, from traditional to modern, you know, all the early chapters in the development textbook, growth-centered policies. Now, this shifts in 1970s, where we have a kind of a development in the mainstream, what I called elsewhere late neoclassical economics, where the focus is on market and government failures. But this is not a humbling sort of recognition, but further from that, it's actually a kind of a process, theoretical process unfolds where failures provoke further marketization, further economization, and of course, financialization. So in a way, neoliberalism corresponds these developments in the mainstream discipline of economics. And the interface here, first, of course, well-known, not structural transformation, but structural adjustment programs at the heights of IMF and World Bank, but at a kind of more sort of, you know, for instance, World Bank policy level, a kind of what late Professor Sanyal was thinking about, a governmentality approach of poverty alleviation and good governance. Now, in a way, this sort of can be conceptualized, just to give a little visual help to this, as the old school versus the new school in the discipline of economics or development economics, which leads us to contemporary mainstream. And the keywords, if you like, structural transformation, structural adjustment, and poverty alleviation. And if we can think about the timeline in terms of the shift from Keynesian developmentalism to neoliberalism, and of course, let's be a little resource determinist, end of cheap oil being a key moment, thinking about Mitchell's work, Timothy Mitchell's work here. And then, of course, at the discipline of economics, we have earlier the neoclassical transformation and then late neoclassical transformation as a later phenomena. Now, if we can think about the main line of debate here, and you know, this is very fairly established question: what causes poverty? Lack of growth or growth itself? And the narrative that I gave is in the mainstream and in a way lack of growth side, but of course always throughout this period, dependency school and radical approaches question growth itself as the cause of poverty. So maybe just again at the sort of to get into the more interesting part of democratic economy a little faster, I may just give you a quick sort of outline of the main theoretical problems of the old school, where growth is ultimately seen as a remedy, and then the new school, where it is a kind of a consequence. Underdevelopment is explained as a consequence, a negative consequence of opportunistic behavior of representative individuals in context of market and government failures, where the new agenda, which is maybe Amartya Sen's very important work, brings to the table, yet also get articulated in this kind of a governmentality of the poor approach, and which leads to the contemporary mainstream, where we have two main sort of contenders at the mainstream: the new institutional economics, where the question is whether or not the sort of global south can institute the good economic institutions of the north, mainly referring to property rights and incentives, and the poor economics, which is in a way what my presentation today is addressing against as an alternative. And I don't want to spend too much time over it. There are excellent discussions of randomization or randomistas in the literature, but here development is sanitized, underlying processes of exploitation, dispossession, and accumulation are occluded, and it is reduced to a matter of designing appropriate public policies and implementing them, a mere technicality that can be resolved through implementation of the right mechanism, a kind of an ongoing auditing process of aid. So what could be the alternative to this? In the remaining 13 minutes, I would like to sort of get a handle of that and develop the perspective, an alternative perspective. In order to, one main point we can make is that sort of growth generates social and ecological conflicts, and these should be foregrounded. And in a way, any development economics or the approach to development or the question of development should bring the issues of conflicts generated by growth to, it would be sort of a critique of the individualist framework, where the society is viewed as an aggregation of individual agents, has to be questioned and criticized, and alternative approaches, solidaristic and communitarian approaches, should be foregrounded. And three, that the prioritization of economic growth as an essential precondition of human betterment should be also questioned, and a democratization, participation, degrowth in the face of climate change should be also foregrounded. So these are kind of very general principles. And in this context, I want to bring this issue of democratic economy, and it's a very innocuous name, and maybe you will figure out what it means more clearly, but it is a name that is used in the context in which what I'm going to talk about, that is politically Southeast Turkey, geographically Northern Kurdistan, not Rojava or Syria, but Northern Kurdistan, which is in the borders of Turkish state, where there was, during the peace process, 2013 and 2014, an attempt to build a dual power, a kind of alternative economy aside with the mainstream economy in the region. And there was a concerted effort, and I want to kind of give you a perspective of that concerted effort in my attempt to counter the methodologies, this sort of fieldwork methodology of randomization or randomist, so to speak. So the perspective here, as I see it, but this is not my own work only, this was a collaborative effort, and I will keep the names of other people involved for various reasons, political reasons primarily, and I will give you a process of rather than as much as the content. So, and one way in which to build the dual power, we have to relate to the economic field in a new way. This implies that in addition to practicing anti-capitalist politics, the necessity to devote time and energy to reimagining the economic field. This means imagining the economic field as something that continually needs to be constructed. That is, through different institutions or theoretical institutional matrix, as we talked about earlier through Escobar. But the fact that the field is always needs to be constructed and reproduced, which also means that it can be reconstructed in new ways rather than being fully and totally captured, saturated, and enclosed by capitalism. Now, here my reference here is, of course, most recently J.K. Gibson Graham's work, but we can go back to a multiple mode of articulation of mode of productions debate, or even, of course, 1917, the revolutionary context, especially the period of new economic policy in Soviet Union and elsewhere, where there are multiple modes of productions and questions of transitions are on the foreground. So there's a very rich Marxian tradition here that considers the economic field as diverse. Here, the second point is the strategic and tactical, and I underline this, rather than the survival of the constitutive diversity of economic practices and the constitutive ineradicability of economic antagonisms in these diverse forms. And three, institutional key areas of economic decision-making as ethical and political side, as opposed to, as neoliberalism and even the more modernist approaches see, a technical side. So the framework here is, of course, helpful, and the one some of us proposed in our engagements was this reading The Economy for Economic Difference. If you maybe you're familiar or not with this framework, but it is actually a creation of a mapping of any economic formation, where on the first line we have the mainstream economy, and in the second line we have the alternative economy, but not necessarily radical alternative, but a kind of in between. And here you can think about state-owned enterprises or green capitalists in the enterprise category, for instance. And then in the sort of lower tier, we have more radical alternatives or more non-capitalist-centric alternatives that are possibly existing in all social formations with differing degrees. So the aim is to use this framework to create a mapping of the economy in a way that actually represents existing economic difference, to strategically build up an alternative economic framework and also a strategy to build dual power. And there is also nodes of ethical political decision making, and here there is also a kind of an antagonism between two visions, if you like. And again, democratic economy is the phrase that was used to describe, but you can put there a kind of radical economic democracy, or a social ecology approach, or a kind of an approach that can be seen as a socialist approach, but the word is democratic economy because that was coming from context. And then the keynotes are the needs, encounters, consumption, commons, surplus, and investment. And while neoliberalism tries to turn these into technical issues, a democratic economy would need to politicize and also foreground the ethical, political impasses that may be here in each of these nodes and bring them to democratic negotiation, the foregrounding of democratic negotiation. Here, the process that I'm going to tell you about is the Democratic Economy Conference that happened in November of 2014, just before the northern and southern Kurdistan and also Rojava, West Kurdistan, northern of Syria, descended into a much more hot civil war, and the peace process has come to an end. But this process that I'm going to describe happened prior to that. And it started with the invitation of the Kurdish political parties, some figures in that, to some academics in Istanbul, Turkey, to create a kind of thinking group about what can we do with the alternative economy. And some
5
of
minutes.
us, sure, some of us who are actually sort of involved in this decided, rather than bringing our theoretical framework, let's start to get into a conversation with the activists from the Kurdish movement and also non-Kurdish activists from the broader left and academics to learn about where the perspective of social ecology that the Kurdish movement was articulating coming from. And we started by, as all good sort of lefties do, a reading group bi-weekly, but this wasn't just a reading group. This was where people come in and present their experiences, and different people from different aspects of the movement step in, and we read text by Öcalan, we read text by other sort of important figures and groups in the movement, and then we decided to become